Hello then. Welcome
All
to.
right.
I don't. We haven't really named this, have we?
Yeah, no, we haven't. But honestly, I feel like that'll be something we we do eventually. Right
Yeah.
now, I think it's just good for, everybody to get to know who we are and just hear us talk, and we'll cross that bridge.
All right. So you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. So my name's Austin Pomper. Just um, I got interested in monarchy about probably, I want to say, at least 5 years ago now, but I think I was already an advocate for it back in high school and maybe a few years earlier in my life. Um, Currently, I'm going to college, going to university for environmental science, specializing in pollution remediation. Um, and yeah, I have a profound interest in politics and government and the way these things work. I'm I'm not really sure what else I want to say as an intro. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think that's enough. I'm Neil Niladani. Um, I was born in the U.S. I grew up in Israel. Um, I'm Jewish for what it's worth. I didn't really get into monarchy until really the last year or so. I've kind of taken an interest in politics for a while, but I kind of went from one political party to another and kind of trying to find my ground in it. And wasn't really until lately I kind of started to feel like the whole the system itself that we were working on was broken. And I was looking for different alternatives, and the thing that kind of put me on monarchy is a bit strange, but something that would be familiar to people who are monarchists is the gentleman by the name of Mad Monarchist is his channel, and he really kind of opened my eyes to some of the disinformation about monarchy, and some of the things that I've known were basically completely wrong. A good example is the French Revolution. I think when I thought about it, it was more like a kind of like the American Revolution, but it was far bloodier, and the French monarchy, which I was taught was bad, was really not that bad. I mean, there were some hard times, but I wouldn't say it's because of the monarchy. So that kind of led me down the path of looking more into monarchy and figuring out that it's not only as silly as one might think, especially here in America, but it actually makes sense. And for me, right now, it seems to make the most sense as a form of government. Um, but I'm fairly new to this, so that's where I am in my journey.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think studying history, especially like if you study the history of the United States, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, just, European history, world history in general, um, I feel like that is somewhat how people tend to come to it. I mean, I've been interested in history for pretty much my whole life. I mean, I my cousin also goes to the same university I go to, and he is a history major. I would have loved to have been, but I took a different path. And I remember I would visit him for some of his uh, class sessions, and I went to museums with him and his class. And actually, I did. I was more active in that class than some people who actually were registered for the class, and I wasn't even registered for it. So I do think that history is some way that people will come to this kind of system. Not really not in the beginning as a viable political institution, but they'll probably study, the people of the past. A lot of people have studied the Roman Empire. A lot of people studied China. A lot of people will study Iran and their long history, the Franks and the Middle Ages in Europe. So I feel like a lot of people will study um, history first before they get into it. I'm not sure how you feel about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think most of the conception people have of it and negative views come from the way people talk about history and in a lot of ways lies about it. But it isn't important to kind of go back and realize what it was actually like. I think, on a journey to realize that it it worked better than people say it did. And the fact that people had to lie about it is also pretty telling.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, actually, that'll be a great segue because when you mention people lying about it, are you talking about deliberate uh, falsehoods or maybe deliberate whitewashing of certain
Uh,
parts of history, like people just not
Specifically,
acknowledging things?
yeah, I would say specific deliberate lies, like referring to the French monarchy and how they were supposedly disconnected elitists and, partied all the time while the people were starving, when in reality that didn't actually happen.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I find it interesting, and actually, it's great that there are a lot of programs, mostly on the BBC, that cover this. But there's one program, and the host is Lucy Worsley. She's the chief curator of historic royal palaces in Britain, and she does a lot of monarchical uh, shows on the BBC of a historical kind of setup, and one of them is History's Greatest Fibs, and she did one covering Versailles, and it was interesting how she was talking about the tennis court oath, and the Estates General, how they were called, and they couldn't reach an agreement. It wasn't the oppressed proletariat that made the tennis court oath; it was the bourgeoisie. You had town lawyers and doctors, physicians and all that kind of stuff standing at that. They were the middle classes. They were the middle and upper middle classes. So they weren't peasants starving in the field. Now, mind you, obviously, those people would be in the best position to maybe recognize some things that um, certain ministers had gone blind to and were just getting frustrated at the deliberations in the Estates General. But yeah, no, I think that the fact that we don't acknowledge that they were the middle and upper middle classes, that, like you said, will set people off into saying, well, wait, why don't we hear that? Why is that not said? Why is this touted up as almost like a Russian Revolution kind of thing where the people rise up and overthrow their masters and there's all this kind of stuff when it's really just a reset where the middle tier throws off the top layer?
Right. Yes, and in the case of the French, and I could be mistaken on it, so you can correct me, but it seems like the revolution was really funded by the aristocracy there, or the bourgeoisie, whatever you'd call it.
Well, I mean, the Marquis de Lafayette was one of the people that fought, uh, that aided the American cause, and he was a proponent of the French Revolution. So there were people who uh, from all different classes who were on both sides. Now, mind you, even in the beginning, they weren't thinking about overthrowing the monarchy. It wasn't the tennis court oath and then you go straight to cutting off the king's head. That's not what happened. They were trying to establish a constitution, and a vast majority of them were planning to keep the monarchy, but just had a written constitution that maybe reoriented how things were done and actually set the power structures down so that it could be referenced on later. But only after the revolution wore on and a while later did the Montagnards, the Jacobins, they really got the upper hand, and then you get the terror.
Hmm. Yeah, so going back to America, what was the sentiment here after the revolution? Because a lot of things that I hear when I talk about monarchy is, well, the question is, well, didn't we just throw off monarchy in 1706? Like, why should we even look at it as a viable option when we shed so much blood to fight it off?
Um, See, actually, that was interesting because I was just reading actually a quote on this from the convention where James Wilson rises in the convention. It's in the early part of it in 1787. And there's a whole lot of debate going on. It was in June when he said this. I think he was addressing Edmund Randolph, um, or I think it was Rufus King maybe, and he basically said the people of America did not fight against the British monarchy, but rather the Parliament. Their quarrel was not with a unitary power, but rather with a corrupt multitude. Um, you know, there were many founding fathers. You know, Wilson, Hamilton, um, Madison to a degree, but Madison was more of a pragmatist and a realist than anything else. I feel like he was just hoping to achieve an end that would, allow the country to work properly. Even John Adams, you can read in their correspondence and what they said that there's a whole faction of the founding fathers and of the American Revolution itself that didn't see it like how we're taught. We are the inheritors of the Democratic Republican view of things, not necessarily the Federalist view of things, and certainly not a view of a huge faction in the revolutionary days. So, really, very shortly after the new government is established, the new constitution is ratified after the convention, we're moving in a way where we kind of forget the thought process of our founding fathers and what they were thinking and all of the debates that they had. Um, and I think that in doing so, we've kind of grown up with this myth that the United States is always meant to be against against monarchy, against any kind of hereditary power, unitary power, or perpetual power. That we really don't like it or accept it, and I'm not sure why. It's like one of those unspoken things where it's just the word that gets us going. Just the word monarchy. We hate it. A lot of us don't even know why we hate it. We just say, "Oh, we hate it." Why? Well, the revolution was against it, and it's like, "Are you sure?" And if you ask, "Are you sure?" and you go back to the source and it's not there, then I feel like you got to start asking questions like, well, should we really be this prejudiced against it? And did our founders even want us to be prejudiced against it?
Right, because nowadays America is so synonymous with democracy and a republic. Probably one of the reasons is because we've spread it out throughout the world as much as we could, that it's kind of hard to think about the founding fathers thinking anything else for the country.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because it's very, very powerful in our worldview and in our mindset, and so much of our history has grown up around it that it's difficult to really take the blinders off and to see anything else. I mean, just a quick quote from John Adams to Benjamin Rush when this is a letter to him on the 9th of June in 1789. And he says, I do not consider hereditary monarchy or aristocracy as a rebellion against nature. The only institutions that can possibly preserve the laws and liberties of the people, and I am clear that America must resort to them as an asylum against discord, seditions, and civil war, and that at no very distant period of time. So he's basically saying, and I paraphrased a lot there, I have everything underlined, but he's basically saying that, you know, monarchy is not a rebellion against nature, and monarchy is not an unnatural or un uh, a form of government that is incompatible with liberty or freedoms. He's basically saying that if we're smart, as this nation grows and as we move along and as we become stronger and larger, we're going to want to adopt more monarchical institutions or maybe start shifting in that direction so that we can protect ourselves against tearing ourselves apart. Because I forget who said it, but I think it's just a maxim that, once superpowers become so large that they no longer can be challenged from the outside, they'll they'll eat themselves from the inside instead and kill themselves that way. The only danger to a superpower is itself.
Right, yeah, I can't think of it right now as well, but I do remember. Um, you mentioned that he was referring specifically um, generational monarchy. And when I think about monarchy, the hereditary part of it is really important for the stability and really the structure of it. Um, do you want to try to kind of talk about why hereditary is important? Why not just
Yes.
have an elective monarchy?
Yeah, sure. And then yeah, and then I'd like to turn the question back around to you after I answer it because
Sure.
I'm curious to pick your brain on that too. Um, with me, hereditary monarchy is important because if it's just another elected process, then it becomes harder and harder to justify its even being there. Unless, well, at least if it's not traditionally there. You know, a fair amount of elected monarchies have a long tradition of being so. For instance, the Catholic Church is one of them. Um, but then there are other nations in the world where, you know, elected monarchies are by and large a thing. Um, I think in terms of the structure of government and in terms of what we want the monarchy to achieve, uh, for me, it has to be hereditary because if you want the monarchy to achieve stability and communal cohesion in the wider nation, then you're going to want it to be unelected. Why? Well, you're going to want it to be unelected because elections are by nature divisive. They're fought and won on partisan grounds, on ideological grounds, on political grounds, and they'll divide whole groups of people that do not, cannot, and ultimately will not accept the ideas of the other side. They just can't see eye to eye, and that kind of difference becomes wider as the distances between people become wider. So you'll have people in Virginia or in West Virginia that simply cannot accept, understand, and don't even want to understand what the people in California and Colorado and Oregon are doing. And you know that exists all over the the 50 states, all over our nation. You know, there are so many people that have so many different views of things that they could not agree on that. Um, and so that's in terms of the structure. That's one of the main reasons why I advocate for hereditary monarchy because if you're trying to bring people together and make sure that the government has a function where it can continue to move forward regardless of the political temperature, regardless of the political scene in the legislature or in the various states or amongst the governors or amongst the people. You're going to want something there that can continue to march forward while we're doing all that other political process. You want something that is um, within the political structure, but not of it. So you want something that can allow our government to function, allow it to work, continue to move it, continue to do things in it, but not be reliant on needing to win over a popular mandate, because ultimately public opinion shifts. It shifts so quickly that that it's really not a good system to have, especially when it comes to long-term stability.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree to that. Aside from the elective part of it and the fact that it does create division, and to me, it's not just a matter of the process can get clogged up in the politics of people because public opinion shifts. It creates animosity where there was none.
Mm.
Um, when people have the power to vote on something so important as the leader of the whole country, it bestows them a responsibility that they wouldn't otherwise have, and it tends to make them kind of rise up to the occasion and a lot of times kind of apply that force on other people. Now, like you said, it has a divisive structure in nature where if you, let's just say, you're pro-gun or anti-gun, and so you don't by yourself have the power to really affect change. So you have to join a kind of a political group, a voting bloc to affect that. But then the voting bloc that you join is going to have a whole other set of ideas and ideologies that you tend to align yourself to that because you have already joined their bloc. So now you're adding all kinds of beliefs that you wouldn't otherwise have just for the fact that you're in that voting bloc where you wouldn't otherwise be.
Mm,
But to me, it's also important the hereditary part is one of the things I like about monarchy is in a republic, when you vote a president for power, you've got in the US, you've got 4 years or 8 years. You've got the maximum of two terms, and each term is 4 years. The system itself doesn't allow much room for long-term growth and prosperity. It's all about the here and now. And the first term, it usually revolves around getting reelected.
mm,
So the leader has every incentive to spend as much money as he can, sacrificing the future now so he can get either reelected or at the very least be remembered as something as a force of good. And if something happens 10, 20, or 100 years down the line, well, they don't care because it's not them. They're not going to be in office anymore. In a hereditary monarchy, not only is a person sitting in office or as a leader practically his whole life, his successors are going to be his offspring. So it makes no sense for a monarch to sacrifice long-term prosperity for short-term gain because he's going to be affected by it. If it's 20 years or 30 years, he's personally going to be affected by it. And typically, as a person, you want to leave something better for your children. So even as far as 100 or 200 years down the line, they've got an incentive to have long-term prosperity. So if you don't have that hereditary lineage and you have an elective or whatever, you kind of take that incentive away. So to me, that's one of the major important things about it being hereditary.
yeah, yeah, and that's honestly a standard monarchist or royalist maxim that goes, way, way back. Um, our founders even used it to just go back a sec. And they said that the best thing about a hereditary monarch is that their time their time frame, how they see their own position in their own office, is a very, very long one. They're not just focused on the here and now. They're focusing now, a few decades down the road, and for the rest of their own life. And they also look to the future. How can I set up everything so that my successors will get something better? Not to mention that they're in the best position to not have to bow to kowtow to the whims of partisan politics. Talking about, like, the difference between an elected system, an elected president, and a hereditary monarchy. Um, think back to not just previous President Trump and President Obama, President Bush, but try to think about the rhetoric, not only of them when in office, but also in the campaign and their actions, undoing what the previous government did, constantly trying to solve issues that could have been avoided but were just created based on, partisan ideology. Just having to, you'll find even when presidents in their second term are not so much interested in walking on eggshells. A lot of presidents in their first term walk on eggshells. They toe the party line and they try to be a mediator so that they can ingratiate themselves with the people who elected them. But then in their second term, because they know they're not going to get a third one after that, they they simply take more riskier action, and you'll see a lot of hoo-ha against that from the Congress and everything else. It's just that the system as it is seems incapable of moving. It can't move, and it seems that if you had a hereditary monarchy in that position, it would be easier to have it move. I guess if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if you're saying that it's just kind of an accident or incidental situation. I would go so far as to say that by design, it's meant to not move in that way. Because when talking about the two major political parties, which in the US you've got a duopoly, and there's not really, you've got libertarians, you've got the Green Party, you've got all kinds of different parties, and it's almost impossible for any one of them to be elected or even into small positions. And that has to do a lot with our voting, the first past the post voting, which basically means that any vote not to your party or not to the party that most closely aligns with you as far as the large parties is basically a vote against you.
Mm,
Um, but also the people that we do elect into office, they have an interest in not really fixing the problem, because if they fix it, they can't really run on the same problem.
mm,
They can just keep running on the same problem and say, oh, the other guys are gonna, you know, give you this problem or make the problem worse, and collect donations and keep getting reelected while the other side does the opposite of them.
mm, yeah.
So, uh, to anybody that is looking at politics, especially here in the US, you've got to know that the system is broken and isn't working. You know that obviously they have different ideas on how to fix it than we do, but I don't know that there's a lot of people that look at it and say this is fine, this works, we shouldn't really change anything about it.
Mm. Yeah, and honestly, I mean, when you said by design, you're kind of correct there. I mean, the system was designed by the founding fathers to be placed at tension with itself, but that was to block, legislation or from any one branch of government becoming tyrannical, becoming all powerful. Even late Justice Scalia said that, he said how in other countries they look at the United States as a laughing stock because it's gridlock. And he said, well, actually, the gridlock was designed to be there. It's so that there couldn't be over legislation. It's so that we didn't pass arbitrary or unnecessary things. It's so that the Congress wouldn't devour the presidency and the judiciary or vice versa in any one of the other three ways. It is kind of designed that way, but also at the same time, I wonder that if maybe we might be looking at this also from a different angle. You and I spoke earlier about how uh, how very different individuals of very different ideological backgrounds or religious backgrounds, social backgrounds, anything, they can find a common cause, a common loyalty, a common ground in the person of a hereditary monarch, even if there is not one in place. And simply, we live in the United States, and there's obviously not one here. Um, but we find common ground in seeing the need for one and understanding that there is a need for an institution similar to that. I don't know if you want to speak on your own political affiliations or not, but I mean, I see myself as somewhat a mix of liberal and conservative. I'm not so much a libertarian, maybe socially liberal and structurally conservative, but you know, I voted for the current president in the last election, and I know you did not. So I find that that's kind of interesting how um, a monarchy can bring together people far better than a system that is supposed to, be their voice, that is supposed to speak on their behalf. It seems like the um, the electoral system as we have it now tears people further and further apart. I don't know if you want to speak anything on that.
Yeah, so obviously you mentioned I didn't vote for Biden. I voted for Trump, and I'm a pretty MAGA type person where I don't even really consider myself Republican, because when I look at the Republican Party, I don't see how it actually represents me. One of the things that I am, and I used to be more libertarian, so maybe that's why I'm pretty anti-war, and so it seems to me like when I look at the Republicans, I guess the rhinos is what you call them, I don't see them passing a lot of meaningful legislation. A lot of it is just playing kind of blocking the Democrats, and they're not really doing a good job of that. But when it comes to war, they're all for it. You know, all over, yeah, everywhere in the Middle East, and when the Democrats are in power, they like to talk about spending, but when they're in power, they spend like nobody's business.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, there's probably not a lot of places online where someone who voted for Biden with your worldview can sit with me and kind of talk about and agree with something. And I think I kind of recognize that when I look at the past few years, my political ideology has changed a lot because of kind of where I align myself.
Mm.
And I think if there was a monarch, even if I didn't necessarily agree with it, because it doesn't really matter who it is at this point, the fact that I wouldn't really be able to do anything about it, and there's not the kind of like race to get your guy in power, I think that would be a lot better for everybody, and I would be okay with somebody, even if the monarch is pretty different from what I believe right now, at least I know that the person, the position he's in, and the system that he'll work in, at least incentivizes them to benefit us in the long term.
Mm.
Whereas even the guy that I voted for in the 8 or 4 years that they work, and they're not able or willing to affect a lot of good change, and it's unsustainable. I mean, if you look at the situation, what's going on right now, January 6th, I mean, the riots, the lockdowns, it seems like it's the civil unrest is going to keep growing, and eventually it's all gonna spin out of control to the point where we don't really have a functioning government anymore.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I mean, um, it, it has progressively gotten worse, over the past decades. And, you know, uh, ima- it's not hard for a lot of people to imagine how they felt. If you're of the opposite political affiliation, it's not hard to imagine how people might have felt, and we can all see it because they put it up all over everywhere. Screaming basically the sky is falling when Obama was elected. There was a whole group of people that absolutely hated him, abhorred him, and they kept that up for his 8 years in office. Same happened with President Donald Trump. Just now a completely different group of people absolutely abhorred him, hated him, and tried to, just destroy him from the very outset. With Obama it was the birther movement. With Trump it was whatever he said. And also, Obama, there were racist caricatures of him, all this different kind. He's a Muslim kind of thing. It was absolutely unbearable. It's completely ridiculous.
Hmm.
And now you have with Biden, I mean, he had this running meme of him as a gaffe machine like for years, and now he's the president, so of course that continues and it just gets exasperated. But what happened on January 6th and when Biden was elected instead of Trump, now again the tables completely flipped. So again you have the conservatives basically repeating exactly the same shtick and rhetoric that the Democrats and the liberals did against Trump, 4 years before. So we're getting to that point where it's almost like at this point it's a verbal tug of war with some punches here and there to the other side. I
Hmm.
just worry that like what people are going to do if this tearing continues. And
Right.
just think about all of that stuff, all of that occurring, that people they're solidly in the other bubble, either the Republican bubble, the Democrat bubble, the Trump bubble, the Libertarian bubble. They can't see eye to eye. And that's why monarchy, I love it because it allows people to step out of that bubble, to cross those boundaries and to talk. That's why I like this.
Yeah, or maybe a better way to say it is there's at least one unifying bubble everybody can be in, and
Yeah.
there's still gonna be disagreements, but at least they're share the same bubble. There's something that's cohesive socially, whereas right now it's not far from running. I don't know if people talk about parallel economies and parallel cultures. It's you know one of the things that people talk about is Texas secession, and every time a Democrat gets elected, they talk about secession and stuff like that. So it's not unfeasible for us to have actual parallel countries in the near future with the way things are going, because it's getting to a point where a person on one side or the other doesn't have to interact with a person on the other side, not socially, not economically. I mean, everything can be completely disconnected and not ever hear about the other's true opinion except for what the so-called leaders of their own side tell them the other side is saying.
Yeah,
Um, so having a monarchy, I think, is definitely absolutely necessary to have some sort of base that everybody can work off of. And then again, there's gonna be disagreements, but at least you can talk about them, and it's not gonna have this divisive us versus them, red versus blue type situation that we have now. Which, yeah, I just don't see it alleviating. I don't think there's anything holding us back. I think this runaway train doesn't have any brakes, and not a whole lot of people are paying attention to that. They're still kind of focused on the us versus them part.
I completely agree, and I think you're right. And if we are a train without brakes, and we're going at full throttle, and we have been. And I think, like you said, when a Democrat is in office, the Republicans talk about states' rights. I thought it was funny how when Donald Trump got into office, the Democrats started talking about states' rights, and the Republicans switched. So that speaks to the need for there to be some kind of legitimate separation of control. We shouldn't be in a state where whoever sits in the White House or whoever sits in Congress, we act like it's the end of the world. They should not have that kind of power over our souls. That we should be able to live in communities and in areas of localization or even state areas that they should not be able to affect us in this kind of way, and it's kind of dangerous. And even in terms of the political divide, like we were both saying, they'll each seek to disrupt and to undo what the other side tried to do previously, or they'll try to block it, or they'll try to not have anything happen because they don't want there to be a win for the other side. If it's a win for them, then that's fine. But they're always trying to compromise and get the other side to agree with what they're saying so that they can claim it. And it's just really, really terrible. And one of the benefits, going again back to why an elected monarchy would not work and a hereditary monarchy would, is that the hereditary structure freezes that factional and divisive and ideological split. It stops it in its tracks because being born into the position, raised in the position, educated on how to properly perform it, shadowing, your parent, shadowing the current monarch, doing all the things that, we would like to have set up in this country. You're in that best position with which to act, to fill the executive branch, because you don't come from any political parties. The best way to bring people together is to put somebody in there that doesn't belong to any of them. Because if they belong to one of them, then all the rest will feel cut off. So, they're by nature neutral, and so they're best able to perform that kind of those kinds of actions. They're best able to either sign on to a bill or reject it, and it goes back to the legislature, and maybe they'll pass it by a supermajority. They're best able to appoint judges to the Supreme Court or any of the other federal judges. They're in the best position to, and judges are supposed to be neutral. We've seen a lot of justices being appointed, for party reasons. If you have a hereditary monarch in there, well, guess what? They don't belong to any of the political parties. They can appoint whoever they want, and they don't have to worry about what Mitch McConnell says, or Nancy Pelosi says, or Donald Trump says, or anybody. They can just put in who they know would operate best. So it's by nature completely different, but is paradoxical in how it would benefit us
Yeah,
based on the American point
and funny you should bring up the Supreme Court, because those are lifetime appointments,
of view.
and I don't know how many people know this, but the reason they are lifetime appointments is that so that they are not beholden to the president who puts them, who appoints them. The whole point is once the president appoints you, then none of the political favors or beholdings can really materialize because you're there for life. Basically, there's no way to take you out, so you have no motivation to appease them. You're supposed to do what's right for the nation, for the Constitution, and uh, there's no reason that the same logic doesn't apply to the presidency itself,
There's
or
absolutely
or,
no reason.
or an
You're right.
office.
And I mean, I think it's funny how there are people, from both sides of the aisle. It's almost like they're talking about monarchy, but they're not actively acknowledging that they are. You'll find people, maybe liberal talk show hosts or liberal news or conservative or news or conservative talk shows or whatever. They're talking about how the Supreme Court and the Supreme Justices are supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to be neutral. Once they're in there for life, so they're politically beholden to no one. And I think to myself, when they say that, I say, duh, there you go. Take it one step further. Who appoints them? A partisan individual. You can see the break there, a cognitive dissonance. It's this break that should not exist, but does.
Yes, absolutely. So when you talk about monarchy in the US, how exactly do you envision it? Since we're kind of talking about the mechanics of it already.
Yeah, why not? Let's go on that. I'm good with that. I envision a future monarchy, and I'm not going to mince words here, an imperial monarchy, because let's be honest, America is basically an imperial power. Um, I see them as taking over where the presidency leaves off. So, it's a reorganization and a restructuring of the office of the presidency. Um, and to do that, I do. That's why I said in the beginning of this that I was, looking at what the founders said at the convention. To do that and to do it properly and to kind of see how the government and the structure would interact with itself, I go back to the letters of the founders, to their correspondence, to the constitutional conventions, to what they themselves said, to what they said to each other. And a fair amount of them are very adamant in saying that monarchy is a representative power. It's not just the Congress that represents everybody, and that a monarchy is some weird deal from ancient times. Republics and monarchies have existed for all of history, basically. The Swiss cantons existed at the same time as all of the empires in Europe, the Italian city-states, Roman Republic, and the Greek kingdoms of the East. So, this stuff has always been there. Um, and the founders saw monarchy as being a uniting force and as being applicable to representative government. At the time, and you might ask me this, but I guess I'll go a little bit further ahead. At the time, they knew that they couldn't set up a monarchy like what I'm talking about. They couldn't do that because the sensitivities of the nation were not aligned properly for that to happen. But they debated on it still in the convention. You could read that to this day, and there are 3 volumes online that are all the notes from the Constitutional Convention of 1787 compiled. Um, and you can read their private correspondence, and they say that, you know, we hope that at one point, the United States will get, and its people will get to a place where their prejudices against it, they cast it off and they start to look at these things realistically and practically again. They don't have this extreme hatred of it because there's no reason why they should. So they say it won't happen now, but at some point in the future, they'll reach that point where they'll start to talk about this, where they'll start to debate this, where they'll bring it to the floor and they'll actually see it as a way for them to move forward and to unite themselves. So I see it as basically the presidency restructured as a hereditary monarchy. Of course, there will be some switching around, based on what they said the powers of the presidency should be. They said for appointment to executive departments, there should be no advice or consent role for the Senate, or if there is a role for the Senate, it should only be an advisory sense. They should only have a vetting power, but they should not have the power to consent because that's an intrusion into the executive branch. They rested with um, the the qualified veto. They made peace with the fact that it was a good idea that the Senate or the Congress should have an override of the veto, but for a reason, because they didn't want the veto to be the nuclear option. So if the veto is able to be overridden, it's kind of difficult, but it's still able to be overridden, then the executive will not be nervous about using it, and they'll use it more often. They'll be more, they'll look more into the bill, they'll read more into what doesn't make sense, what should be revised, they'll veto it, send it back, and then that whole process will continue. And we set on the terms of the Supreme Court justices. So that's how I envision the future. What about yourself?
Yeah, I envision something very similar. It's funny because when I think about a monarch and the kind of powers that they have, and I think the president basically has everything I would think a monarch should have, and I think a lot of people don't realize, again, kind of going back to 1776 and fighting the UK, the president now has vastly more power than any monarch at the time.
Mm,
Um, so at this point, it's not a matter of the monarch wouldn't have any more power than they'd have. That they just kind of replace the president, the executive office. The major difference would be in that kind of thing would be the hereditary part of it. Um, I would like to see a change in the House and Senate, and maybe make more of a Congress, and maybe something along. I'm not super solid on this. I'm again, I kind of don't have my feet under me when it comes to that because I'm still exploring this. But I would think something along the lines of maybe have the governor from each state represent their own state in Congress, or a couple of people from the each state's Congress. I feel like a representative that actually lives in the state and is elected by the not just the state as a whole, but every kind of county and area voting district has a lot more accountability to its people than even our senators and House members that are in the federal government.
mm.
And so I think I would trust those more than I do, again, even our own federal senators and House members.
Yeah.
So something along those lines. But for the executive branch, yeah, I would say mostly keep it intact as it is. Just have a monarch instead.
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked about how I would have the vice president also be reorganized so that the heir apparent would sit in the Senate and replace the VP. That would make the most sense because the VP is already part of the executive branch and crosses over into the Senate as president of the Senate. Um, and so I would just replace the VP with the heir apparent. Um, and that way they would also have practical firsthand experience with the workings of the legislature. They would get to know the members of the Senate and the House, probably also, especially when the State of the Union address took place. Um, so you'd have the heir have practical experience. Obviously, you wouldn't put them in there like say it was a minority. You wouldn't put a 5-year-old into the Senate. You'd probably have somebody else fit that role. Probably the president pro temp, the longest serving senator would fill that role until the heir came of age. Um, but then also in terms of the governors, um, I floated the idea of the governors being appointed by by the central government, maybe by the monarch, maybe by the monarch with consent of all the cabinet members, maybe by the monarch with consent of the Senate. Um, and then they could all, take that place, and then the governor would appoint one or both of the senators, or maybe we just do a repeal of the 17th Amendment and have the senators um, be nominated or appointed once again, because the Senate not supposed to be as divisive as the House. The Senate is supposed to be the tempering voice in the legislature, and plus it's where the states' sovereignty is recognized. Those areas of citizens as a whole, and so if you have direct election to the Senate, it completely throws a monkey wrench in their whole purpose for being there and their whole purpose in not having one house in the legislature. If you just want everybody's voice to just, get thrown around in the legislature, you shouldn't have a bicameral legislature. It should be unicameral. It should only have one, and it should only be the House of Representatives. But the states are there, the senators are there so that they can provide also a good check and balance within the legislature itself and to represent a completely different sphere. It's so that the few cannot tyrannize the many and the many cannot tyrannize the few. It's kind of a bulwark against that very real possibility. Um, so I don't know. There are a lot of different things we could all try out.
Absolutely, and I like the idea, especially of the what is the vice president now being the heir apparent, because not only does it have the benefit of them gaining experience and kind of learning from the current monarch, it's also a good opportunity for the people to get familiar with the next monarch, and kind of build that level of trust as well, so
Yeah,
that when they do step into power and get coordinated next, people are already familiar with them. They're not, obviously the royal family would still be familiar to an extent. There's obviously going to be a lot of attention to them, but you get to see them in the realm of government, performing their duties. So yeah, I do like that idea.
yeah, and there has been a long tradition of monarchies all over the world where the heir or the current sovereign has fought in wars or has been part of the armed services. I think that that would be a good thing also for the heir apparent to do. Especially as a prerequisite before they enter the Congress. Because you know frankly, how and this we don't have enough time to get into this, but how our armed forces is treated, especially just the veterans. There aren't a lot of advocates for them, and I don't think they're being they are treated as they could be treated, or they're not thanked in the ways that we should be thanking them, especially when it comes to us lacking in veteran benefits and all that stuff. I don't think that if the armed forces are that important to us and to a lot of people in the United States, have family and friends and all that stuff, and one whole party is all gung ho about them, why we should have homeless veterans or why we should have veterans that, are on drugs or that commit suicide or all that stuff. This should not be happening. That shouldn't
Right,
be
or
how things
struggling to
work.
get VA benefits, and
Yeah.
funding for that seems to be an afterthought for really any party.
Yeah. It's kind of
It's
a shame.
Yeah.
And at
Um,
least then they'd have an advocate for them.
exactly. Or really, all or the whole people as a whole would have an advocate.
Definitely.
Um, I don't know if we have time to get into it, but a question I was asked, because you mentioned monarchies all over the world. What monarchy today can you point to and say we should do that, or that is a good example of monarchy?
So you mean like a current royal dynasty or maybe a historic example
A,
or
a current one. It's a
current?
question I was asked when I was talking to somebody about monarchy. Is what is a good example right now of a functional monarchy that exists and not historical?
Okay. I would just say probably I would have a different example if it was historical, but if we're talking about present day, I'd probably say the Principality of Liechtenstein. And like I said earlier, when I mentioned that, I know it's a cliche, but I do find it interesting how the principality, the prince has genuine authority in the government, and acts in a just and conscionable way, but they still have representation. The wider people, they have representatives, but it's also pretty much a direct democracy given the size of the place. The place is very small, the principality, but they still vote and they can have plebiscites and they could do all these things. They call it a semi-constitutional monarchy because the prince has power in government. So they invent that phrase to make it sound that it's not as representative or as modern as it could be. It's almost like when they give it that name, it's to kind of show, that this is not kind of compatible with the sensitivities of most modern people. But really, that's all it means. Semi-constitutional just means that the prince is not a figurehead, which I'm completely fine with. But I also don't think that constitutional monarchy should dictate that the monarch should be a figurehead. Um, I think that doesn't make any sense to me, and we'll probably get into that as we go on with this.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, if it was a historical example, I would have said Austria-Hungary for different reasons. But yep.
Okay.
What about yourself?
Um, to be honest, I still really haven't looked into enough to really get a good example of one. So
Mhm.
I'm gonna have to kind of defer that question and maybe answer later.
All right.
Um, I'm not even at the point where I fully understand which monarchy I like. Obviously, there's constitutional, there's absolute, and I think there's a mixture of kind of monarchy and other forms of government.
Yeah.
Um, a constitutional monarchy seems to make the most sense, certainly the most feasible if we ever get it here in the US.
Yeah.
Um, but then there's a little bit of draw to absolutism, and if voting has it causes issues on a national scale, maybe it also causes issues on a local scale. Um, but it seems that in local elections, there's a little bit more cohesion between people.
Yeah.
Um, because at the very least they're neighbors, even though a lot of neighbors nowadays are could be are as far apart as they might as well be from different countries. But maybe some talk about next episode.
Yeah.
Just a little bit less division with local elections and voting blocks. So that could make sense as a good compromise where
Yeah.
you
And the
don't
reason
surrender
and the
complete power.
yeah, and the reason for that is because I guess the issues are a lot closer to home. They're they're the people understand what they need to get done. It's just an issue and why monarchy is probably better at a much higher level, at a more continental level, because there's no way that anybody from Maine could have any idea what's going on in Texas or Florida or Michigan or Washington. You just can't comprehend all those things, no matter if you look or not.
Hmm.
Um, so, do
I
we want
know.
to have closing remarks now, or
Yeah, we can go ahead and close it out. I think
well,
maybe kind of laying out what do we actually hope to achieve with this here,
so what?
with
Well,
our.
since I went first in the opening, why don't you go first in the closing, and then you can set me up for that. What would you like to see, or what would you hope would happen as a result of these changes?
um, if we're talking about just getting the monarchy, and what I would like to see is getting back to a more unified country, just kind of stepping back from the precipice and from the division, and being able to talk to people like they're your countrymen again. I want to see a leader who is able to take long-term responsibility for the country and not just short-term and not just promise for now to get elected and then completely renege on all his promises or as far as more of like our conversations here and this podcast, I'd like to get a wider audience and kind of bring awareness to people that this is an option and it's not as ridiculous as it sounds, but also I'm kind of hoping to really expand my own knowledge and find my feet under me and get a better understanding of monarchy and the way it would work so that I can make a better decision on where at least what I'd like to see as a form of government.
Yeah, that's a very respectable point of view. And I kind of want the same thing. I also like to do this podcast or these like collaborations between us to get the message more out there to a wider range of people, and also to again show them that this is an option, but also to get them to think about why it's an option, to get them to maybe kind of reconsider what constitutes a government, reconsider what things can be representative, or where limits of certain governmental or authoritative jurisdictions are. All these different things. I'd like to reopen the discussion because so many people just see it as being um, a topic that will just cause fights, and so they just choose to ignore it, or they just shut it down, don't want to talk about it. So I think that continuing with this, my hope is to bring it awareness to a wider group of people and to make them think about things, and especially about the United States government in different ways. And actually, I hope that depending on the action we get for these videos moving forward, that people tell us what they would like to hear about. Give us your opinion, because that's actually important and will help us, not maybe be redundant, not continuously go over the same talking points, and maybe address certain things that we haven't.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with it. And I think while most people think it's ridiculous now, monarchy in America is closer than they think.
Yeah, and it might yet be a thing in the future. My
Hmm.
hope is maybe in my lifetime.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for as well.
Yeah. All right. So uh, once again, I'm Austin Popper,
And I'm Neil Adani.
and thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
And next time would be in 2 weeks. We're hoping for a bi-monthly
Yeah.
pace for now. If we need to change that, we'll obviously let you know. But
Yep.
again, thank you for listening and have a good weekend.
Take care, everybody.